Hi, Andy.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm very excited about this conversation. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Andrew Bacevich, an historian at Boston University, retired Army officer. You served in Vietnam. You're a well-known critic of American foreign policy. And you are most recently co-founder and president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank that hopes to occasionally inject a note of skepticism about the wisdom of military intervention into the Washington discourse. Is that a fair?
I think that's very accurate.
Yep. And we're going to talk about your new book, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory, just out. You've published other books, including The Long War, The Limits of Power, and The New American Militarism. Now, this book strikes me as, in a way, a kind of a grand unified theory in the sense that it seeks to explain two things. One is how American foreign policy got, in your view, so screwed up. The other is how Donald Trump came to be president. You see these two things as having something in common when we look at their roots, right?
Yes, but it's in my effort is not simply to explain how American foreign policy got screwed up, but also how our political economy got so screwed up with the incredible inequality that we have come to recognize. And also how American culture got to be so screwed up. I use the term culture here really to refer to how we have come to define freedom.
Okay. So let's put that on hold and get back to it in a few minutes. And first make sure people understand your view of foreign policy. Those who haven't been paying attention, you've been a pretty prominent figure on the foreign policy discourse scene. But if you had to kind of sum up your criticism of American foreign policy, what would that be?
When the Cold War ended, we lost our way. While the Cold War continued, and let me emphasize the horrific mistakes of judgment made by the United States during the Cold War, with Vietnam being the most prominent. But I think in some senses, the Cold War had a sort of a regulating effect on how members of the foreign policy establishment conceived of our role in the world. And when the Cold War ended, history supposedly ended, that regulating factor disappeared, and we kind of went nuts. We went haywire. In the foreign policy realm, what that meant was that we laid claim to this notion of being the world's only superpower. We came to believe that we possessed a military capacity to basically win any war against anybody quickly and economically. And that led, I think, to a pattern of misusing American power, which, of course, then was strongly reinforced by the events of 9/11. What do we end up with? We end up with wars that go on, that cost a lot, don't seem to accomplish much. And to the other point you made, I think to some degree that's how we end up with a guy like Donald Trump being our president.
Well, elaborate on that part a little bit.
Well, I tend to see, I argue in the book, that the election of 2016 was a repudiation of a post-Cold War consensus. And with regard to foreign policy, the centerpiece of that consensus was we're in charge. We're running the world. And that claim made by really both parties, we should emphasize this is not Democrats or Republicans, that claim led us into these wasteful wars, which Donald Trump, for whatever reason, whether sincerely or cynically, as he campaigned for the presidency in 2016, had the gumption to say these wars are stupid and they should end. And I think that that is one element that explains his appeal, that there are and have been some number of Americans, to include Americans whose kids end up going to Iraq and Afghanistan and such places, who were fed up with endless wars, and they believed Trump, perhaps foolishly, very much foolishly, believed Trump when he said he would get us out of those wars.
Okay. So, as you suggested earlier, that's not the only connection I think you see between kind of America. Well, what led to a foreign policy you think is flawed, and what led to Donald Trump? There are kind of deeper connections. I mean, your argument is pretty rich and complex, and maybe one way to flesh it out is to flesh out what you call the post-Cold War consensus, which wasn't just about American foreign policy. It was partly about that.
I mean, a second element related to political economy, and that was a belief in globalization. The claim that globalization was going to create unprecedented wealth in which all would share. I mean, they would not share equally. It wasn't that everybody was going to end up being a billionaire, but all boats would be lifted. What we got was inequality, economic inequality, not seen since the Gilded Age. More specifically, what we got was the Great Recession that began in the latter part of 2007 and devastated the lives of millions of Americans. My judgment would be that the people who were most hurt by the Great Recession ended up seeing Donald Trump, again, foolishly, but ended up seeing Donald Trump as somebody who would correct the failures that resulted from our embrace in globalization. And I mean, his promise, of course, was to bring back American manufacturing. He was going to restore the American economy to what we imagine it used to be back in the 1950s. Again, it was all total nonsense, but it was nonsense that I think had an understandable appeal to those who had been most devastated by the actual effects of globalization.
Okay. So this leads to a question. I mean, in your book, you use the term neoliberalism as part of the problem. The kind of globalized neoliberalism is something you're criticizing. That leads to a question about how you characterize your own ideology. You describe yourself as a Catholic conservative, and if all I knew about someone was that they called themselves a Catholic conservative and that they were very skeptical of American military intervention, I might immediately think of Pat Buchanan. On the other hand, I don't think I'd think of Pat Buchanan as using the term neoliberal as a term of derision. I don't think of him as being a big critic of the globalized economy per se. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, my question is, how do you characterize? Is there any broad school of ideological thought that you identify with yourself with, or do you see yourself as kind of sui generis, as kind of not fitting into any one slot?
Good question. I think the honest answer is I don't know exactly where I fit. Probably depends on the magazine article I read most recently that I find persuasive. I think I am the label Catholic conservative is most accurate when it is applied to my cultural perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, my side lost the culture wars. I accept the fact that my side lost the culture wars. Doesn't mean I have to, in a sense, endorse or agree with every aspect of the outcome, but I'm very much a traditionalist on matters that relate to marriage, abortion, family, and such things. My beliefs have been long since swept aside, and my only point in the book is not to somehow make some argument for going back to the 50s in a cultural sense. but to note that while the cultural revolution that we have, I'm about to say endured, but that's too negative, that has happened over the past 30, 40 years, has indeed produced greater freedom for groups subjected to discrimination, women, people of color, gays. I also contend in the book that it gave rise to varieties of dysfunction that permeate American society that may not be directly caused by the Cultural Revolution, but nonetheless should invite us to examine what is this freedom that we now enjoy. What am I referring to? I'm referring to the epidemic of pornography. I'm referring to the epidemic of morbid obesity. I'm referring to the alienation of young people, to the levels of suicide, and on and on and on. We know these are problems. They are frequently discussed in American society. I think they ought to cause us to think more deeply about what we mean by freedom. So that's where I'm a Catholic conservative. I think on foreign policy, I'm a Niebuhrian. Me and Barack Obama.
Meaning Reinhold Niebuhr,
yes,
the theologian.
Reinhold Niebuhr, who among other things said, "Don't be so quick to imagine that your motives are virtuous. And don't be so quick to think that even with the best of intentions, power can be employed so as to achieve good ends with all kinds of, other negative consequences." So in foreign policy, I probably look to Reinhold Niebuhr as the wisest person, the wisest thinker that I have ever encountered. Now, with regard to economy, more and more I somehow think I am ending up being a Franklin Roosevelt style liberal. When I was younger, I think that I found the arguments of Ronald Reagan and his fellow Republicans to be fairly persuasive. Your bureaucrats get in the way. Unleash the economy. Good things will happen. That capitalism can somehow be self-regulating. I think I probably bought into that, back in the 1980s. Now I think that's a lot of bunk. So I guess like Elizabeth Warren, I would say I'm a capitalist, but I'm a capitalist who has come to believe that the economy requires regulation in order to try to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So, that somehow puts me into the among the liberals of the late 1930s and 1940s, I think.
Okay. So you mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr, and maybe we should say that he was associated with something he called Christian realism.
Yep.
And, just as a footnote, an interesting thing about the Quincy Institute is that, you've identified yourself as in some ways a conservative, but in some ways not. And I think at Quincy, there are a number of people who are in one sense or another realists in the foreign policy sense of the term, but they're not. But aside from that, there's a lot of diversity. I mean, there are conservatives, there are progressives, and so it's going to be interesting.
Well, but there's a point to be made here about the Quincy Institute, and that is that we intend to be, and we wish to be seen as what we call transpartisan. That is to say that our staff will include people who self-identify as conservative, who self-identify as progressives. We will stake out positions that can appeal to both conservatives and progressives, and they're going to appeal, we hope, because the good sense of those positions will become manifestly clear to the people we are communicating with, whether they're ordinary citizens or whether they're people in Congress.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say for people who aren't familiar with realism as the designation of a foreign policy school, and who may be curious about, well, what is it that unifies all the people or most of the people at Quincy, say, whether left or right? What is this realism thing that in principle transcends partisan divisions? How would you just kind of quickly characterize realism as a way of thinking about foreign policy?
I want to avoid getting too theoretical here.
Sure.
And certainly realism is a loaded term. Realism is a term that some of the folks, listening to your podcast will reject out of hand, because realists have a reputation of being of having no interest in moral considerations, who want to pursue policies that are devoid of any kind of moral context. I don't think that's who we are. I think we are realists in the sense that we are skeptical of military power. We think we have learned lessons from the American penchant for armed intervention, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that should lead us to embrace greater sense of restraint when it comes to using military power. That said, we are not isolationists. We believe in the imperative of American engagement. We think that there are better ways of engaging others than, airstrikes and invasions. That diplomacy in our country has been undervalued, again, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and therefore there is a great need to revive American diplomacy, to invest in American diplomacy, to become more creative with regard to American diplomacy, and in particular, if you're talking about the Middle East, to use diplomacy to find a way out of these dysfunctional relationships that, for example, have us treating the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a close friend and ally, and then, of course, treating Iran as, the Antichrist.
Yeah, I would say, on the question of kind of realism and morality, I think you're right. Realism has a reputation for being ruthless, almost amoral.
Yep.
One reason is that one of the most famous realists in history is Henry Kissinger, who did seem willing to see large number of foreigners die for what he perceived as American interests.
Fair enough.
I think you're right that in the current and recent context, realists would argue that the policies they favored would have reduced the number of human beings who died, not just Americans, but foreigners. And in that kind of consequentialist sense, is a moral foreign policy. The other thing you kind of allude to in contrasting the way the American foreign policy establishment views Saudi Arabia and Iran is, I think realists are very kind of anti-monarchism and anti-moralistic even, wouldn't you say? Which isn't the same as being anti-moral. That's different. But almost a certain skepticism of easy moral judgment.
Yeah, and I think on that point, at least my version of realism, I don't know if it's the authoritative version, but I think realists take history more seriously, and therefore are not quick to reach judgments about good and evil, who's right and who's wrong. And I think actually the history of U.S.-Iranian relations is an excellent illustrative example of that. We've got our gripes against the Islamic Republic. We probably date our gripes from the aftermath of the revolution and the hostage crisis, which was enormously humiliating. Not just humiliating for Jimmy Carter, it's humiliating for the nation. We've got more recent gripes. For example, when Iran intervened directly in our Iraq war, it certainly led to some number, maybe a contested number, but some number of U.S. casualties. So we have our gripes. On the other hand, and this is what I think a realist would insist on the other hand, guess what? They got their gripes. Going back to the 1953 coup that overthrew, where the CIA and MI6 overthrew Mossadegh, but even more immediately, recall the aftermath of 9/11. Americans have totally forgotten that in the aftermath of 9/11, the Iranian government offered assistance as the United States prepared to intervene in Afghanistan. It wasn't that they were going to send troops to fight alongside us, but there was an agreement between Tehran and Washington that if American pilots went down in Iranian territory, they would assist us in ensuring that the pilots were recovered. Well, what they get in return for that? What they got was, A, labeled as part of an axis of evil, even though they had nothing to do with 9/11, and found themselves then really next on the list of the Bush administration's freedom agenda, pursuant to a policy of preventive war. So we ask ourselves, who's this guy Soleimani, and how dare he act against U.S. forces in Iraq? Well, the answer is because with considerable reason, the Iranians thought they were next on the hit list. And so they were, from their point of view, not defending this, from their point of view, they're acting defensively. And I think that's the pattern of thought that realists would embrace, rather than, well, there's good guys and they're bad guys, and of course we're always the good guys.
Right. And I would really want to pause and isolate one thing you said is you said, you were looking at things from their point of view, which I think is very characteristic of realism, an insistence on viewing things from the point of view of every actor.
Yes.
And not excluding any actors on the basis of moral judgments about them. And then you added, which isn't the same as defending them. And I think what gets in the way of looking at things from the perspective of all the world's actors is the kind of natural, seemingly kind of natural human intuition that to explain why somebody did something you don't like is to excuse it. And I think realists would insist on separating those two exercises and say you should always try to understand why people do things, and that doesn't imply forgiveness or moral judgment one way or the other.
No, absolutely not. You are correct.
So let's use this issue of kind of morality to get back to your argument. So your argument is that this the post-Cold War consensus was characterized by a certain hubris that kind of cut across bounds, right? I mean, yes. It was our mission to export our economic model. It was our mission to export our moral model in a certain sense, which we assumed yes. everyone would be naturally receptive to as soon as they saw the light. Yes. And relatedly to export our conception of freedom. Yes. Right. So is that kind of the single, that's the biggest picture view of the big mistake as you see it?
Yeah. And on this freedom issue, we insist, and when I was a kid, I would have certainly endorsed this. A kid, when I was in my 20s, I would have endorsed this, that American values are universal values. They are as applicable in Iran as they are applicable in the United States. Further, and we believe this despite the fact that our values continuously change. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, our values did not include the notion of equality for people who were gay. Discrimination wasn't necessarily endorsed by everybody, but it was accepted. It was legal. And then we came around to the realization, and I'm not questioning or challenging this, that was wrong, that gays are equal in every respect. And within a week and a half, we've got people in Washington, D.C. insisting that other societies should therefore comply. I mean, it's comic in a way. If others did likewise, we would laugh. We would dismiss this out of hand. But this gets to sort of the lack of self-awareness, I think, with regard to who we are, and the conviction that somehow history has summoned us to propagate those values, our values. Why do we think that's true? Well, I think the answer is in part because of the spirit that informed the founding of Anglo-America. You know, the famous sermon by John Winthrop about creating a city upon a hill. But I think more recently, a reading of our history, of world history, that seemed to affirm that. And here the key moment, of course, is World War II, which we believe we won. We've sort of forgotten the contributions of the Soviet Union and other allies. And we also have persuaded ourselves that in the aftermath of that great victory, and it was a great victory, that we demonstrated our capacity to spread our values in countries like the defeated West Germany and Japan. And I think those memories of World War II kind of distorted, you know. Those memories of World War II, I think, carried over and sort of, in particular, reappeared on the scene after 9/11 and animated the George W. Bush administration to set out to pursue this freedom agenda in places like Iraq.
Yeah. So, yeah, you pay a certain amount of attention to Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History.
Yep.
To you, that kind of embodies the hubris, I guess, the idea that.
And I'm not picking on Fukuyama here, not in any respect. It's timing. You know, there is a moment when someone makes a particular argument, and the country, the world, says, "Yeah, that's true. That provides the basis for how we are going to go forward." I think that's what happened with Fukuyama. You know, in the book, I said, there are plenty of other examples. You know, toward the end of the 19th century, when a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan was proposing a more expansionist foreign policy, when a historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, said, "Well, the frontier is closed, but that doesn't mean the American project is going to end." These guys became very, very famous because of what they wrote, and it's not the brilliance or the originality of the argument; it's the timeliness of the argument. That's what Americans like Theodore Roosevelt, just to take one example, at the end of the 19th century, wanted to hear, and wanted then to be able to act upon. Mm-hmm. So the same thing applies to Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War. This notion of history having ended was one that just seemed right to his listeners.
Yeah, and as you say, he didn't create American exceptionalism. It goes way back, and in fact, the question I guess arises: was the imperative of American exceptionalism so strong that if he had never written that, the country would have found some comparable argument to seize on and hold up as a banner? A
different sacred text. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then you go through, I should say you do kind of, in a way, your story starts in a way after World War II, because the attitude that you see prevailing after the Cold War, you see reflections of in the Cold War, John Foster Dulles' pronouncements at the beginning of the Cold War and so on. But why don't we pick the story up as the Cold War is ending? There's a series of presidents. I think there's a narrative according to which there are from the left at least, there are the enlightened foreign policy presidents, like Obama, maybe Clinton, and then the unenlightened ones like George W. Bush. And you're telling most of them are pretty unenlightened. The one you certainly give a hard time to Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama. What do you say less, as I recall, about the first George Bush? You do talk about him. He did, we did get into some conflicts under him, but Do you view him as kind of as bad, so to speak, foreign policy-wise, as his successors?
Well, I'll push back against the as bad, but in my perhaps artificial construct, George Herbert Walker Bush was the last Cold War president.
Okay.
And his successors, Clinton, Younger, Bush, Obama, this trio, they are the post-Cold War presidents. And they are the ones who, and this I guess is where I'm disagreeing with you, were to some degree captured by this post-Cold War consensus. They did not come to power with sort of a blank slate. They came to power with a set of expectations in place about what the United States was becoming and what it was intended to achieve. Now, they emphatically did not agree on all things. But I think that, and one could write a 600-page book about how Clinton differed from the younger Bush, who differed from Obama. People will write those books. But I think there is some utility in focusing not on how they differed, but on the continuities between each of these administrations. And that's what I try to do. Again, I'm not perfectly legitimate to focus on how they differed from one another. But I think you get a somewhat different and yet valuable insight to see how they were the same. Same thing applies, let's say, to the Cold War presidencies. You know, if we start with Harry Truman and Ike and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and so on, they differ from one another in myriad ways, and yet they're all Cold War presidents. Mm-hmm. They're all presidents whose administrations were powerfully shaped by the conviction that the United States really had no choice but to continue this contest that it was locked in with the Soviet Union. Yeah, the tactics differed, but the premises remained in place until basically till we get to probably the second half of the Reagan administration.
Yeah, I mean, even Jimmy Carter, you think of him as a post-Vietnam president and as a liberal and everything, but he felt compelled he began the proxy intervention in Afghanistan.
Yes. And why? Why? Because the Soviets had intervened in Afghanistan. And so he was persuaded, I think, by Zbigniew Brzezinski more than anybody else, that it was therefore incumbent upon the United States to see this as a challenge to the West, and therefore respond by our own indirect intervention, which, of course, then sets in motion results that neither Carter nor anybody else could possibly have imagined.
No, absolutely. Arguably, Al-Qaeda would not have come to we don't know, but it could well be the case that Al-Qaeda would not have come to exist had we not, started a big proxy war in Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, the Soviets intervened first, but we're the ones who turned it into a proxy war.
Well, there too. But so why did the Soviets intervene? I think it's fair to say that we know now that the Soviet leadership in the Kremlin perceived that disorder in Afghanistan posed a threat to the Soviet Empire, particularly to those Soviet republics that had a Muslim majority population. So they believed they were defending the empire. Right. We believed that this was the first step in what was going to be a long march across Iran to Saudi Arabia, which was, in a military sense, totally absurd. But when they intervened in Afghanistan, in addition to starting the covert operations in Afghanistan, we have Carter setting in motion the creation of U.S. Central Command so that we would then begin to gear up to fight in places like, initially we thought we'd fight in Iran, but ultimately fight in Iraq and elsewhere. I mean, I'm sort of giggling here, and I shouldn't, because it's so deeply tragic, with so many lives taken, ruined, populations displaced. And in some senses, it all goes back to a misperception on the part of the Soviets and a misperception on the part of our leaders in Washington.
Yeah, well, isn't this a recurring theme in world affairs? Kind of on the one hand, nations are very insecure. They perceive a lot of things as threats. And then when they react in what they see as a defensive way, what they do is perceived as offensive by another nation.
The problem worse.
Yeah.
They make the problem worse.
So you would say much the same thing, just as all Cold War presidents were ultimately Cold War presidents. You would say all post-Cold War presidents were captured by the post-Cold War spirit, which had a certain amount in common with the Cold War spirit.
Yeah.
There was a moment there when I thought the first George Bush was really going to do something interesting, set a really important precedent. I mean, I remember seeing the Security Council deliberating on something, and it may have actually been the Persian Gulf War, because the Persian Gulf War, whatever you want to say about it, it was approved by the Security Council. In that sense, it was consistent with international law. It was a response. It wasn't some kind of intervention into the internal affairs of a state. Right. It was a response to transborder aggression. Classic exercise of Security Council power. And I remember thinking first, well, this is so strange, seeing the UN kind of come to life as a meaningful body. It had been, completely paralyzed by the Cold War. And also, I kind of liked the idea. I wasn't a supporter of that war particularly, but I kind of liked the idea of a president taking international law seriously, Security Council seriously. That kind of fell by the wayside. I mean, I guess even within his own administration, it wasn't consistently applied. He did decide to go to Panama and seize the president, which is without anybody's approval. But that kind of, well, let me ask you first of all, how do you feel about? Are you a big international law aficionado? And is compliance with international law in interventions a big part of your thing?
I don't think so. I mean, to your point about the Security Council, the Gulf War of 1990, 1991 was really an exception to this paralysis. I think the United States, I think the world community would be foolish to look to the Security Council to play the role that the creators of the UN imagined that it would play back in 1945. I believe in international law, this far. My sense is that great powers honor international law when it is convenient for them to do so, and they discard international law when it's no longer convenient. And I think that, there's a little bit of a law of the jungle about that, but the law of the jungle is the law of the jungle. And so, the notion that there is going to be some international, world government that is going to bring about world peace, I just don't take that seriously. As a realist, I continue to believe that the relations of great powers are the principal between great powers are the principal determinants of whether we live in a time of peace or in a time of war. And therefore, it's crucial for the great powers themselves to regulate those relationships, to create conditions in which mutual coexistence is possible. That doesn't create world peace. It doesn't eliminate all the humanitarian disasters and horrors that are part of our lives. But I think the avoidance of another world war is a very worthy goal, and it's not something that we should take for granted just because we haven't had a world war since the early 1940s. And so I think realists want to tend to relations between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia, between the United States and those important second-tier countries, Japan Germany, South Korea, Turkey, and that the creative diplomacy that I think the Quincy Institute would advocate, not that we have a 5-point plan for how it's all going to work out. The creative diplomacy that we advocate is engagement, intensive engagement with these important countries to try to figure out how we can avoid the catastrophic global war.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I would say, I mean, I am something of an international law obsessive, I guess. But I would say if we could get American policymakers to take the Security Council more seriously, it would exercise a restraining effect on our military interventions. Because,
but Bob, why would you expect that the Chinese government is going to adhere to international law, or the Russian government?
I wouldn't expect them to immediately automatically do it, but I do think precedent matters and norms matter, and it's not inconceivable that we could have cultivated more international respect for the opinion of the Security Council if we had not been so hypocritical in our use of it. And nations do tend to be hypocritical, but I do think at the end of the Cold War, we were in a kind of unique position.
Okay, and let me adjust my position because I agree with you. I mean, I think the case here has to do with the use of nuclear weapons. That over a period of time, I guess in a legal sense, beginning with the early negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the creation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there has evolved a set of norms that view the use of nuclear weapons as beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that the government of China will never use nuclear weapons, nor that we will never, nor that the state of Israel will never. But I believe that the existence of those norms will give them pause in what will be very useful ways. Anything that tampers with that norm about a prohibition on the use of nuclear weapons is a really bad thing. So in that sense, I'm with you.
Yeah. And I would say there's value in trying to normalize things like adjudicating boundary disputes via international forums. If, maybe that's hopeless, but I think in general, it would be in our interest to kind of cultivate respect for the transnational adjudication of things.
The way you put it is absolutely correct. Yeah. I guess there is a realm of problems, security problems, that I would see that probably lie beyond solution through those means. Mm-hmm. But and that's a specialized realm. And everywhere else, it seems to me that what you suggest is what we do, and probably have done. Mm-hmm. There are treaties that Americans know nothing about that relate to the seabeds, that relate to outer space, that relate to a variety of things that have yielded good for all of us, meaning everybody on the planet, and therefore those patient diplomatic efforts to solve problems deserve our approval. Absolutely.
And they don't always get it. We still haven't, we're still not part of the Law of the Sea Treaty, right? The U.S., I think, still hasn't signed on.
You haven't ratified that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we're part. I also think outer space. Trump administration just released its budget. We're going to spend a ton of money militarizing outer space. Might be good to just pause and see if we could establish some norms and international agreements that would at least save us some money.
I absolutely agree. Trump said, and no doubt he said this with the Pentagon's encouragement, that the United States needs to dominate outer space.
Yeah.
Not be present, not to protect our core interests.
Yeah.
We need to dominate outer space. I mean, the folly of that. And again, I don't think it's simply Trump's folly. I think it reflects a paranoid national security mindset that is pretty well established within the national security arena.
Yeah. Okay, so to pick up the story of your book after the George Herbert Walker's Bush's tenure, I mean, for starters, you see 1992 as an important election because there is so much foreshadowing kind of the Trump phenomenon in terms of the political forces that Pat Buchanan, who enjoyed a little bit of success in primaries, and Ross Perot, the political forces that energized those campaigns. I think you're not alone in seeing as foreshadowing the election of 2016, right?
Well, and I perhaps less persuasively, I throw Hillary Clinton into the mix.
Yeah.
In 1992, people on the right perceived her as a forerunner of cultural radicalism. Mm-hmm. And in some senses, she was. I mean, in the present moment, we would define her as a centrist, but back in 1992, she was not. And so, yes, in my book, I argue it's obviously important that in 1992, the incumbent president Bush Sr. lost to this young, charismatic governor from Arkansas. But I think that it is the campaigns of Buchanan and Perot and the presence of Hillary Clinton as Clinton's de facto running mate in a way that gave us some hints as to the reaction against the post-war consensus that was coming and that would then would come to fruition in 2016 with the candidacy of Donald Trump.
I think the first time I heard cultural elite hurled as an accusation by Republicans was around that time. I think Dan Quayle was the one I heard use it first, but it became common. And an example of the kind of remark I'm sure they seized on was Hillary Clinton's remark about, I'm not going to stay home baking cookies. Right. There are women in America who were proud of their cookies, and
yes.
and I think they weren't, they didn't see that as a sign of respect.
Right.
92 happened. So Bill Clinton's foreign policy, say a little bit about that.
It's fascinating, So he's the draft dodger president. I mean, that's the way he was characterized by his opponents. And my argument is that the pattern of intervention that George Herbert Walker Bush began, you mentioned Panama, not insignificant. Certainly, Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War of late 1991. Not to be forgotten, the intervention in Somalia, which he initiated after being defeated for re-election. Basically, he handed Somalia off to Clinton. Now, Clinton had, in running for the presidency, had wanted to reassure voters that I'm no George McGovern. I'm going to keep America strong. I will use force when it's necessary to do so. My argument is that he expanded on the pattern of interventionism that the senior Bush began. He did it by escalating in Somalia, which led to the fiasco of the Mogadishu firefight. He intervened in Haiti, albeit no shots were fired. He intervened in response to humanitarian catastrophes in Kosovo and Bosnia. We forget the extent to which there was continuing sparring with Saddam Hussein. Throughout the 1990s, Saddam had managed to survive in power. We were running combat air patrols on a daily basis over north and south, northern and southern Iraq, frequently dumping munitions on air defense and radar sites. He bombed Afghanistan, trying to kill bin Laden. He bombed a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. That's quite a record of of activism. I don't think it didn't frankly amount to a hill of beans. Apart from the Balkans, there were nothing that even approximated a decisive outcome. But I think that over the course of the Clinton presidency, we became kind of comfortable with using force in a way that we were not, for example, in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War. And then, of course, Bush gets in, the younger Bush, 9/11 happens, and it's off to the races, global war on terrorism.
And before 9/11, Bush was talking as if he was going to actually be a departure from Clinton's pattern in some respects, right? He was talking like a realist and
it's irony piled on irony, Bob. You're right. Remember, his position with regard to foreign policy was elect me president and I'm going to be humble. I'm not going to, it's not my business to tell the rest of the world how to live. 9/11 happens overnight. He becomes Woodrow Wilson. And we're embarking upon what he, in a slip of the tongue, referred to as a great crusade. And
arguably a poor choice of words.
But nonetheless, 9/11, whatever constraints remained with regard to the use of force, and I think they were pretty slight, 9/11 removes them. And there we are, bogged down in Afghanistan, bogged down in Iraq. We can't even count the total number of lives that have been lost. We're trying to figure out the total number of trillions of dollars that we've expended. The number is probably something like 6. And it got precious little in return from my point of view.
Yeah, and I think, in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion, you have, what came to be called ISIS starting to kind of take root and metastasize. No telling how different things would be. Now here's something you wrote in the Los Angeles Times on either on the eve of the invasion or right after it, but it was back before anybody knew exactly how it was going to work out, and most people were confident it would work out well. And here's what you wrote. If, as seems probable, the effort encounters greater resistance than its architects imagine, our way of life may find itself tested in ways that will make the Vietnam War look like a mere blip in American history. So you were certainly prescient in seeing it not work out well. Why were you two things. Why were you so confident it would not work out well? I mean, what were the warning signs in your mind? And also, would you say that it has been that catastrophic in its outcome? You write, our way of life may find itself tested in ways that will make Vietnam look like a mere blip.
Come on, Bob, it's an op-ed. You have to juice it up a little bit.
Okay, so we'll discount by 22%. Give it the op-ed discount.
I think on the first point, I was wary of what kind of nation-building project that we were about to embrace. I certainly didn't anticipate in any detail what kind of resistance would occur to the American occupation. But my gut was that it was going to be a hell of a lot tougher than was advertised by the George W. Bush administration. If it turned out to be that I was mostly right, probably chalk it up to lucky guess more than anything else. As to testing the American people, well, in one sense, that was a mistaken judgment, because our endless wars really haven't tested the American people, because the American people haven't been involved in the wars. It's been a very small subset of American society that has paid the price. Even the dollar price, we don't attend to. It just gets added to the national debt. Somebody somewhere down the line, I guess, is going to have to figure out how to pay the bills, but not the present generation. But we have been tested in the sense that our post 9/11 wars have contributed to, not created, have contributed to the growing divisions in our society that made it possible for somebody like Donald Trump to to not only run for the presidency, but to win it. And you don't want to oversimplify, but it does seem to me that the catastrophic decision to invade Iraq contributed in a very significant way to how we end up where we end up in 2016 and how we end up where we've ended up in 2020 as still a deeply divided nation. We prepared to go through this drill all over again.
Yeah. And I mean, again, to get back to ISIS, which might well not exist if not for the Iraq invasion, if it, well, I won't get on my hobby horse. I mean, there are lots of ways, I guess the war contributed to Trump's being president, including the ongoing turmoil in the Middle East,
yes.
that gave him something to talk
yes.
about and helped unleash a flood of refugees that he could deem as deeply threatening and so on.
I mean, whatever the Bush administration thought it was doing, some of these guys thought they were spreading democracy. Some of these guys thought they were going to, I think, establish a regional American hegemony. Whatever they thought they were doing, what they ended up doing was creating horrible instability. And the instability haunts the region today. And even though we continue to have troops there doing whatever they're doing, there is no chance whatsoever that further military efforts on our part are going to restore stability to the region. And that's what it needs more than anything else. I know, yes, they need economic development. They need, democracy. They need to embrace liberal values.
Yeah.
But first, they need to find a way to restore stability. That's a problem we did more than anyone else to create, and we don't have a fix for it.
Yeah, I'm always kind of grimly amused when people describe Iran as the most destabilizing country in the Middle East. It seems to me we have a much stronger claim to that title.
Absolutely.
I mean, seriously.
No, absolutely. But again, there's this absence of self-awareness that is part of who we are, because it seems to me patently obvious. What is the country that that uses force, that invades, that bombs more than we do, and so rarely achieving the positive outcomes that we say we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. No, there's a number in your book. I forget the number, but this leads us to Barack Obama, where it's something about the number of drone strikes he did in a year or something.
Yeah.
It's just, I was aware of this and was complaining about it, but still, when I saw the number or heard the number in your book, I was listening to the audiobook. I just almost couldn't believe that that kind of thing is going on, totally beyond the awareness of almost all Americans.
Because the only thing Americans care about in the military sphere is American casualties.
Yep.
There was a pretty strong pushback against the George W. Bush administration when Iraq went sour, and we were losing like 100 killed a week, thousands wounded. There was pretty strong pushback. What Obama figured out is if there are no Americans getting killed, you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And so you use airstrikes, you use drones, you rely on highly skilled special operations forces for missions of very brief duration, like the Obama took down Obama, and you get very little oversight, and that was his contribution, I think, to this this continuing militarization of U.S. policy, despite the absence of political success.
Right. Now, that's the model Trump would like to adopt. I mean, he would rather not see any ground troops getting killed, but he's fine with lots and lots of drone strikes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and he continues to recite the lines about ending endless war. You scratch your head trying to figure out when the people who support Trump are going to realize that with very few exceptions, actions do not coincide with rhetoric. And that's particularly true with regard to our military posture in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So is your view, I mean, as we record this, I think Americans, an American strike killed within the last week or so or two, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And that's considered, kind of a big breakthrough, a big prize. Right. Is your view that, I mean, the obvious question is, if Obama's strategy was so successful, how come we have to keep doing it year after year, right? I mean, the problem doesn't seem to be getting smaller. Is your view that that the kind of impersonal version of war, the kind of just drone strikes on everything we deem as a terrorist cell that might conceivably afflict the United States at some date in the future, is it ineffectual? Is it modestly effective? Is it counterproductive? Does it make the problem worse? Do you have a take on that?
Probably modestly useful in the sense that it keeps terrorist organizations off balance. They're constantly going through the process of trying to figure out who's going to be the new leader to replace the one that the Americans just killed. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in indispensable men, so I sort of figure that they are going to come up with a replacement, and therefore they continue their cause. The real problem, I think, is that we are engaged in wars without a well-defined political purpose. What's the outcome? George W. Bush imagined that a quick, decisive victory over Saddam Hussein would yield the political outcome of a stable, more or less democratic Iraqi state aligned with the United States. That obviously didn't happen. But what is the political purpose for which we are killing people today? I don't think that question gets asked, and it certainly doesn't get answered very clearly. We kill them because we perceive that they pose a threat. Well, maybe they do. But when we kill people, it ought to be because this serves some longer-term identifiable political purpose. And when we accomplish that purpose, there will be no more war. The war will come to an end. I don't think we have any clearly defined political purpose in what we used to call the global war on terrorism.
Yeah. And in fact, if you look at the actual successful terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11, I think more often than not, first of all, they're not people who kind of came from abroad and found a way to get from Yemen to the United States. They're people who, by their own account, are motivated by the grievance that we are killing people in Yemen, right? Or Afghanistan, right. Or Iraq. The country they mentioned varies, yeah. But more often than not, that's their complaint.
Yep.
So, okay. So Trump, I guess, I guess, I mean, you tell me, he certainly hasn't wound down the forever wars even by his own definition. Leave aside drone strikes. I mean,
right.
we're everywhere we were, when he came into office. Do you imagine, let's assume then, and this isn't all that unlikely, I think, that he's reelected. Do you imagine, I mean, why, maybe this is, it brings us back to the thesis of your book, probably. Why is he unable to do what he says he wants to do? Which is, he periodically says he wants to get troops out of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. So far, little if any progress. Why is that?
I think one explanation is that he is weak. I mean, he talks big, makes big promises, but has shown very little ability to follow through and make it happen. He's easily distracted, I think. He doesn't pay attention. And the other factor there, I think, is that there is a national security establishment that is devoted to a militarized conception of what we like to call American global leadership. It's a conception that requires us to be spending $700-800 billion a year on the Pentagon. It requires us to have something on the order of 800 military bases around the world. It requires us to posture our forces to intervene, not to defend Texas, not to defend California, but to be ready to intervene anywhere. And it tends to shape the debate over foreign policy in a way that privileges the threatened use and the actual use of force. There's a whole lot of people and organizations in Washington that I think they're honestly committed to this. It's not that they're all corrupt and dishonest, but they cannot imagine an alternative approach to U.S. policy. I mean, one of the purposes of the Quincy Institute is to argue for an alternative. It's going to be a long haul for us to make that argument, but we do think that it's a worthy undertaking.
Yeah, probably is going to be a long haul. Reminds me of something you say in your book. You're talking about a time some years ago when you were you would be featured on TV or whatever, or you'd write your op-eds, you were debating kind of against a very interventionist stance. And you say at some point you realized it was pretty much just theater. I mean,
Yeah.
you were playing a role that somebody had to play. Somebody had to be the official anti-militarist.
Yeah.
It was you. But the outcome was kind of foreordained. So strong were the forces that would ultimately decide which candidates kind of weren't allowed to be president and so on, right?
Yeah, and so there's a pretense of debate. There's making a show of balance and of considering alternatives. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I just came to believe that it was all for show. It wasn't serious. Again, I think it's because the foreign policy debate is so skewed in what direction. Mm-hmm. My argument isn't that we need to be a bunch of peaceniks. I think it's okay for us to have a war party. I think it's okay for us to have one party that believes in militarized global leadership. I'd just like to see another party that took the opposite point of view, and then let's debate. Let's have an argument about based on the results achieved by pursuing this militarized approach. But we don't have that kind of debate because both parties basically agree on the course that we've been following. And that's why Trump has such a hard time, among the reasons, that he has such a hard time actually following through on the promises that he has made to, end our endless wars, for example.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing this dynamic at work in the Democratic presidential race? In other words, are you seeing there's a certain amount of diversity, I think, on foreign policy views there. Are you seeing the less interventionist candidates kind of being beset upon by the establishment? Or
I think what I see is that, and believe me, I don't watch all the debates, all that kind of stuff. But my general sense is that foreign policy is not getting a lot of attention. That the argument is centered above all else on which one of us can actually defeat Trump, and then in terms of substance, it tends to be focused on mostly domestic issues. Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. I'm not slighting that at all, but I think when it comes to foreign policy, not a lot of talk. I mean, there hasn't really been, I guess, maybe with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard, there's an unwillingness, I think, to confront the magnitude of our post 9/11 failures and the indirect consequences that I think we have created, some of which you just referred to a minute ago. Those are not at the center of the process of trying to choose a Democratic candidate.
Yeah, no, as you said earlier, when American soldiers aren't coming home in body bags in significant numbers, it's hard to get people's attention focused on foreign policy, which brings me to one of my nearly last question, I guess. We haven't talked about your service in the military. You retired as a colonel. Yep. You served in Vietnam.
Eons ago, yeah.
Did your experience in Vietnam inform your skepticism about military intervention in any way?
Only in this. I was there relatively late in the war, summer of 70 to the summer of 71. So we're after Tet.
Okay.
We're in the so-called period of Vietnamization. Everybody knows we're not going to win. Everybody knows we're just trying to get out without, obvious catastrophic failure. And the units that I served in, or two different units, I witnessed at first hand the collapse of discipline that resulted from a very long war and a long and mismanaged war. So we had enormous racial problems, drug problems, disciplinary problems. And I think I've thought a lot about the Vietnam War since and have come to other conclusions. But the immediate impact of Vietnam for me was long wars are bad for the institution of which I was a part. And therefore, never again can we allow ourselves to be drawn into such a long war. Well, 40 years later, here we are involved in a long war. And of course, what's different is that U.S. forces have demonstrated a quite remarkable durability. They don't have all the drug problems, racial problems, disciplinary problems that I witnessed and experienced at firsthand, because, of course, we now rely on our so-called volunteers, really what the founders of our republic would call a standing army, which, of course, has allowed the American people, in so many respects, to disengage from what we're doing, what we're having our troops do out there. So the negative consequences of Vietnam in that respect have not befallen the armed forces, but I think we've got other negative consequences that relate directly to the military system that we chose to create in the wake of Vietnam. Okay.
So just to kind of wrap up, we should probably get back to the thesis of your book just briefly. As I said, it's a rich argument, and maybe we should put a slightly finer point on a couple of things. So I take it you're saying that, again, there's a sense that there was a hubris coming out of the Cold War, reflected in the essay, the End of History, reflected in other ways, and having various dimensions, including, and to make a couple of connections between foreign policy and Trump, I guess, including on the idea that we would export our model, our economic model, our moral model, our ideological model to the world, and be greeted, I guess, as liberators. And I guess a couple of connections between the foreign policy and Trump is, one is part of the model was the global, the embrace of globalization that, as things played out, seems to have exacerbated economic inequality in the United States. While lifting a lot of people out of poverty abroad, it's within many nations exacerbated inequality, which became helpful to Trump politically. And I guess you would say, I don't think you put it exactly like this, but the assumption that our kind of the coastal elites who more or less run things assumed that our moral vision would be welcome abroad, and without even thinking about it, maybe took it for granted that it was being welcomed throughout America, right? Like in Middle America, in places where actually it wasn't, and that fact helped Trump. Is that all fair to say?
I think it's absolutely fair to say. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about the book?
Well, I hope people who listen to this podcast will
buy it.
Be inspired to pick up a copy.
I encourage them to do that. It's a very good read. As people can probably tell, you're a very lively and opinionated writer. And so it makes it easy to pay attention. So it's called The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. So Andrew Bacevich, thanks a lot for talking about it, and good luck with it.
Thank you.